On January 18, 1945, the Red Army stopped fighting the Wehrmacht and started racing its own momentum. In less than a week, Soviet tank armies had crossed Poland, entered the German Reich, and reached the Oder River, just 64 kilometers from Berlin. But speed has a price. Infantry lagged days behind. Supply columns stretched hundreds of kilometers. Flanks existed only on maps that no longer matched reality. Soviet armor was advancing faster than command, faster than logistics, faster than doctrine allowed. The question was no longer whether Germany could stop the offensive. The question was whether the Red Army could survive its own success. If you're here for how this race nearly tore the Soviet advance apart, the 80-kilometer dash, the drive into the Reich, and the moment momentum became a liability. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay with the story. Let's begin. In Part 1, we watched the German defensive line along the Vistula River collapse in less than 48 hours. On January 12, 1945, Soviet artillery, over 250 guns per kilometer, pulverized German positions at 3 bridgeheads. By January 13th, the tactical battle was over. By January 17th, Warsaw had fallen after 5 years of German occupation. But the liberation of Poland's capital was a sideshow. The real story was happening 100 kilometers to the west, where Soviet tank armies were racing into an operational void. Terrain the Wehrmacht had considered secure just days earlier, and on January 18th, that race reached a velocity that would shatter every assumption about what armored warfare could achieve. On January 18, 1945, the 2nd Guards Tank Army executed an 80-kilometer penetration in 24 hours. 80 kilometers. In one day, through enemy territory. The advance began at dawn and continued through the night, exploiting capabilities the Germans simply could not match. The T-34/85 possessed wide tracks that distributed weight across frozen ground and snow-covered fields, allowing sustained speed where German armor bogged down or avoided movement entirely. The 85mm gun provided sufficient firepower to engage any opposing vehicle at operational distances. Soviet tank brigades operated in mass formations, accepting mechanical breakdowns as inevitable. A brigade might lose 30% of its vehicles to mechanical failure during an 80-kilometer dash, yet the remaining 70% still constituted overwhelming force at the breakthrough point. But the real advantage came after sunset. Night operations magnified Soviet superiority. German doctrine relied on visual acquisition and coordination between tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns, a system requiring daylight for effective deployment. The 2nd Guards Tank Army moved through darkness with forward detachments navigating by compass bearing and local guides, bypassing German strongpoints rather than reducing them. Rear area logistics units, supply depots, and communication nodes found themselves overrun before warning reached forward defenses. German commanders woke to discover Soviet armor 40 kilometers behind their prepared positions. The Su-76 self-propelled gun proved essential to maintaining this tempo. Its light armor made it vulnerable in static defense, but mobility allowed Su-76 batteries to keep pace with tank brigades. When resistance materialized, a hastily positioned 88mm flak gun, a company of infantry with Panzerfausts, the Su-76 provided immediate suppressive fire while tanks maneuvered. This eliminated the delays inherent in waiting for towed artillery to displace forward. By evening, on January 18th, rifle forces remained 40 to 60 kilometers behind the armored spearhead. The 2nd Guards Tank Army operated in enemy rear areas without infantry support, supplied by captured German fuel dumps and ammunition stocks. This violated Soviet combined arms doctrine, which emphasized coordinated advances with infantry securing flanks. The calculated risk accepted temporary vulnerability in exchange for speed, denying German forces time to establish coherent defensive lines. The 80-kilometer advance shattered German operational planning cycles, rendering defensive preparations obsolete before completion. A border marker stands in snow-covered farmland 15 kilometers east of Hohensalza. A weathered stone post marking the pre-1939 frontier of the German Reich. At 14:30 hours on January 19, 1945, Lead elements of an armored spearhead roll past it without ceremony. Tank commanders in their turrets barely register the significance. The crews have driven 80 kilometers in 18 hours. The geographic boundary means less to them than the next fuel dump or the last reported position of German anti-tank guns. The crossing occurs not as a deliberate operational objective, but as a consequence of momentum. Soviet planning has prioritized speed over symbolic gestures. The tank formations have punched through German defensive positions so rapidly that supporting rifle forces now lag 40 to 80 kilometers behind. The tracked vehicles operate in isolation, their fuel tanks topped off from captured German stocks, their radios transmitting position reports that place them beyond the range of their own artillery support. The physical transition into Reich territory creates immediate tactical complications. German civilians, unlike the Polish populations encountered in previous weeks, possess telephones, functioning civil administration, and direct connections to Wehrmacht command structures. Information about Soviet movements flows westward with new efficiency. A tank column, spotted near Basin at dawn, appears in German situation reports by noon. The operational advantage of surprise begins to erode. Fuel consumption now dictates the pace more than enemy resistance. Each T-34 carries approximately 120 kilometers of operational range under ideal conditions. Snow, mud, and constant maneuvering reduce this to 60 or 70 kilometers. Forward detachments must locate German fuel depots or wait for supply columns struggling through cratered roads and demolished bridges. The armored formation that crossed into Germany on January 19th will reach the outskirts of Schneidemühl within 72 hours, a further advance of 90 kilometers. The penetration represents not a carefully planned invasion of the Reich, but the exploitation of catastrophic German defensive failures. The border marker passed at 14:30 hours marks no pause in operations. No moment of reflection. It simply disappears behind the column. Another coordinate on maps being redrawn hourly in Stalin's headquarters. Another line crossed in a war entering its final, most destructive phase. On January 20th, 1945, at 0940 hours, a radio operator at 3rd Guards Tank Army Forward Command Post intercepts an encrypted transmission from 1st Ukrainian Front Headquarters. Marshal Ivan Konev has issued categorical orders. 3rd Guards Tank Army will execute an immediate 90-degree turn from its westward axis toward Berlin. The new objective lies south, the industrial basin of Upper Silesia. The directive carries explicit reasoning. Soviet intelligence reports indicate German demolition teams preparing systematic destruction of coal mines, coking plants, and synthetic fuel facilities throughout the region. The industrial complex produces 25% of pre-war German coal output and houses irreplaceable heavy machinery. Stalin himself has demanded these assets be captured intact. The cost of rebuilding Soviet industry devastated by 3 years of German occupation cannot accommodate the luxury of capturing rubble. Commander Pavel Rybalko spreads reconnaissance maps across the hood of his truck. The operational challenge materializes in topographic contours and rail junctions. His mechanized fist, 2 tank corps and 1 mechanized corps totaling 478 operational T-34/85s, has maintained westward momentum for 72 hours. Fuel trucks struggle to keep pace. Rifle formations lag 40 to 80 kilometers behind. Now the entire force must pivot through defended terrain while maintaining combat effectiveness. The maneuver violates basic principles of armored warfare. Tracked columns excel at exploitation along prepared axes, not perpendicular reorientation under combat conditions. Each tank corps must swing through a quarter circle while German forces occupy blocking positions throughout Silesia. Supply convoys already strained by the westward advance must redirect along congested secondary roads. At 11:20 hours, lead elements of 6th Guards Tank Corps receive movement orders. The pivot begins. Company commanders orient their tracked columns south-southwest toward Ratibor. Navigation officers calculate new bearing, 185 degrees magnetic. The industrial prize of Upper Silesia lies 130 kilometers distant. German forces in the region possess neither the strength for sustained defense nor the mobility to evade encirclement. the operational friction intensifies immediately. Fuel consumption during the turn exceeds projections by 18%. Radio communications degrade as units spread across widening frontages. The westward momentum toward Berlin, the psychological prize that has driven every Soviet soldier since Stalingrad, evaporates in service of industrial pragmatism. At dawn on January 22nd, rifle commanders measured the crisis with map coordinates and empty roads. Second guards. Tank armies' forward elements had reached Schneidemühl's outskirts. The nearest rifle formations occupied positions 40 to 80 kilometers to the rear. Strung across terrain, the mechanized fist had traversed 2 days prior. Radio operators calculated the separation through failed contact attempts. Tank army frequencies went silent beyond relay range. The gap was not abstract. It was quantifiable distance measured in hours of forced march. The tracked columns had consumed space faster than the infantry logistics system could contract it. Rifle divisions advanced at 25 kilometers per day when roads permitted, 15 when snow drifted across unpaved routes. Soviet armor had sustained 40-kilometer daily advances, sometimes 50 when German resistance collapsed. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Each day of armored exploitation added 15 to 25 kilometers to the separation distance. By January 22nd, that accumulation had created an operational void. Mechanized spearheads operating beyond mutual support range of their rifle corps. Supply convoys illustrated the strain through physical bottlenecks. Trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations queued at river crossings. The armored wedge had passed 3 days earlier. Engineers had constructed pontoon bridges rated for 30-ton loads, adequate for medium armor, insufficient for sustained logistics traffic. Convoys waited 6 to 8 hours for crossing windows. Rifle unit commanders confronted terrain emptied of both enemy and friendly forces. The tracked columns had carved corridors through German defensive positions, then accelerated beyond them. German units bypassed by armor reoccupied crossroads and rail junctions 12 to 24 hours after Soviet armor passed. Rifle formations approaching these positions encountered resistance the spearhead had avoided through speed. Clearing operations consumed time. The distance widened. By midday on January 22nd, the operational map displayed the problem in stark geographic terms. Schneidemühl sat exposed at the end of an 80-kilometer salient, its flanks guarded only by reconnaissance elements and depleted tank brigades operating on emergency fuel reserves. The offensive had fractured into separated components moving at incompatible velocities. The forward detachments of the 4th Tank Army crest the final rise at 13:47 hours on January 23rd. Below them stretches the Oder River, ice-choked, 150 meters wide, the geographic barrier that stands 64 kilometers from Berlin. After a 14-day offensive spanning 350 kilometers, Soviet armor makes visual contact with the objective. The tracked vehicles do not stop at observation. By nightfall, forward elements secure bridgeheads at Onlau and Breg. The 85mm guns of T-34/85 battalions provide covering fire as reconnaissance units probe the ice thickness and forge shallow sections. German resistance at these crossing points remains minimal. The Wehrmacht has not yet concentrated forces to defend the river line. The speed of the Soviet advance has outpaced German defensive preparations by 5 days. On January 24th, the 4th Tank Army extends the breakthrough. Steel columns push north, securing additional bridgeheads at Keben and Steinau. River crossings succeed at 4 separate points within 24 hours. The operational achievement is stark. Soviet motorized spearheads now stand closer to Berlin than several German armies remain to the east. The Oder, intended as the Reich's final defensive barrier, has been breached before it could be fortified. But the armored advance still operates without infantry support. Foot soldiers remain 40 to 80 kilometers behind. The 8th Guards Army diverts 1 corps to envelope Poznan, a fortress city bypassed during the initial thrust. Tank brigades hold bridgeheads with crews originally trained for mobile warfare, now tasked with static defense. Su-76 self-propelled guns provide artillery support, but their 76mm caliber and light armor make them vulnerable to counterattack. The strategic calculation facing Soviet commanders crystallizes. 4 bridgeheads secured. Berlin within operational striking distance, but the extended salient creates vulnerability. The Oder has been reached and crossed. The question facing front commanders on the evening of January 24th is not whether Berlin lies within grasp, but whether the advance can be sustained without operational collapse from overextension. Between January 26th and 28th, reconnaissance reports arriving at 1st Belarusian Front headquarters reveal a threat that forces Marshal Zhukov to recalculate his entire operational geometry. German units, formations evacuated from the collapsing Courland pocket and reconstituted elements from East Prussia, begin concentrating along the Pomeranian corridor, aimed directly at the exposed northern shoulder of the Soviet salient. The advance that delivered 4 river crossings in 72 hours has created a corridor 350 kilometers deep but dangerously narrow. On January 28th, the German roving pocket under Generals Walter Nering and Dietrich von Saucken moved westward through landscape that should have been impassable. The column stretched across 15 kilometers of snow-covered secondary roads, Panzer IV and Panther tanks interspersed with half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadiers, horse-drawn supply wagons, and civilian refugees attached to military formations. The pocket drifted through gaps in Soviet front boundaries that existed only on operational maps, not on terrain where reconnaissance units had pushed beyond the formal lines. The formation exploited a fundamental characteristic of the Soviet offensive: the separation between armored spearheads and rifle forces following 40 to 80 kilometers behind. While second guards, Tank Army lunged toward Kustrin on the Oder, and first guards, Tank Army advanced on the Mieseritz defense region. Nering's units moved through sectors theoretically controlled by Soviet forces, but actually occupied only by intermittent patrols and supply columns. The German force crossed the boundary between Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front and Konev's 1st Ukrainian front during darkness, navigating by compass when roads disappeared beneath snowdrifts. Soviet intelligence tracked the pocket's movement through intercepted radio traffic, yet containment proved impossible. The rifle divisions that should have sealed encirclements were still marching westward. T-34/85S and Su-76S, assigned to pursue bypassed formations, were already committed to maintaining operational tempo. The westward moving units created cascading confusion in the Soviet rear. Supply convoys altered routes, communication nodes relocated. Local commanders reported enemy concentrations that contradicted higher headquarters' understanding of front positions. By January 28th evening, the pocket approached the Oder River itself, threatening to break through to German-held territory and reform as a coherent defensive force. The column represented approximately 40,000 troops and 200 armored vehicles, not a strategic threat to the offensive, but a formation large enough to require dedicated forces for elimination. On January 30th, Stavka made the crisis decision. 1st Polish Army and 3rd Shock Army, originally designated for the drive on Berlin, would turn northward to block the German breakout and counter additional units being transferred from Courland. The roving pocket had achieved what conventional defense could not. It forced the redeployment of Soviet assault forces at the moment of operational decision. On January 31st, 1945, the 2nd Guards Tank Army punched across the frozen Oder at Kustrin, establishing a bridgehead 65 kilometers from Berlin's eastern suburbs. The seizure represented the culmination of a 20-day offensive that had carried Soviet armor over 600 kilometers from the Vistula. While German artillery still controlled bridge infrastructure, Soviet engineers constructed pontoon crossings under fire, allowing T-34s and motorized infantry to ford the ice-choked river before reinforcements could seal the breach. The bridgehead measured roughly 12 kilometers wide and 8 kilometers deep, insufficient for a direct assault on the Reich capital, but critical for future operations. Soviet doctrine prioritized securing crossing sites over immediate exploitation. At Kustrin, momentum had reached its operational limit. Supply lines stretched back across Poland. Fuel stocks approached critical levels. Ammunition expenditure during breakthrough phases had depleted forward dumps. On February 2nd, the Stavka declared the Vistula-Oder operation complete. The pause reflected strategic reality rather than operational choice. German forces still controlled the flanks. Fortress Poznan held out in the rear, while Pomeranian garrisons threatened the exposed northern shoulder. The First Belarusian Front required time to consolidate positions, stockpile munitions, and eliminate bypass strongpoints before launching operations against Berlin. The Bridgehead transformed Kustrin into a forward staging area. Katyusha rocket battalions moved into prepared positions. Artillery regiments, the same formations that would deliver the 20,000-gun barrage opening the Berlin operation on April 16th, began registering fire coordinates across the Oderbruch marshlands. The geographical position locked German defenders into an impossible dilemma. Insufficient forces to eliminate the bridgehead, inadequate reserves to construct depth defenses between Kustrin and Berlin. General Helmuth Weidling's assessment proved prophetic. The Eastern Front is like a house of cards. If there is a breakthrough at one single place, the whole thing will collapse. The Kustrin bridgehead represented that structural failure point. Between February 2nd and mid-April, Soviet forces transformed the salient into a logistics hub and artillery park. When operations resumed 74 days later, the bridgehead served as the primary assault vector for the First Belarusian Front's drive toward the Silo Heights, the final defensive barrier before Berlin itself. The price of the advance stands recorded in stark arithmetic. Soviet forces crossing the Vistula-Oder expanse between January 12th and February 2nd suffered 194,191 casualties, 43,476 killed in action, 150,715 wounded. The speed of the operation, covering 500 kilometers in 3 weeks, did not diminish the bloodletting. Each kilometer cost approximately 388 Soviet soldiers. The 8th Guards Army alone reported 23,000 casualties. The 5th Shock Army, which would later storm the Reichstag, counted 19,000 men struck from its rolls. The German accounting tells a more catastrophic story. Army Group A ceased to exist as a coherent formation. Of the 9 panzer divisions assigned to the sector in early January, 7 were effectively destroyed. The 16th Panzer Division reported 24 operational tanks from an authorized strength of 160. The 17th Panzer Division mustered 11. Infantry divisions fared worse. The 68th Infantry Division entered Soviet captivity nearly intact. 12,000 men surrounded at Poznan. The 291st Infantry Division fragmented into battalion-sized Kampfgruppen scattered across Lower Silesia. When German military cartographers updated order of battle maps in March, Army Group A's designation disappeared entirely, reconstituted as Army Group Center through administrative reshuffling that could not restore combat power. Material losses compounded the personnel devastation. Army Group A abandoned 1,377 artillery pieces during the withdrawal, 354 of them 88mm guns that represented the backbone of anti-tank defense. The Soviets cataloged 583 destroyed or captured panzers. 6 months of accumulated fuel stocks, approximately 18,000 tons, fell to the advancing fronts when depot commanders failed to execute demolitions before evacuation. The Panther tank mounted a 75mm KUBOK 42 L70 gun capable of penetrating 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. Against this weapon, the T-34/85's 90mm frontal armor represented a calculable vulnerability. On paper, German armor retained technical superiority in nearly every engagement parameter: gun performance, optical quality, crew training duration. The defensive failure cannot be attributed to inferior equipment. The breakdown occurred at the intersection of doctrine and mass. German defensive theory relied on elastic defense, allowing penetrations, then severing them with mobile reserves, executing coordinated counterstrokes. This required 3 elements: intact communication networks for coordination, sufficient fuel reserves for operational movement, and numerical density to create multiple defensive layers. By January 1945, German formations possessed none of these prerequisites. The Wehrmacht deployed approximately 1,500 armored vehicles for the Vistula defense. Soviet forces concentrated 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns. This 4-to-1 disadvantage eliminated the possibility of mobile defense. German doctrine required tanks to maneuver, to exploit superior optics and crew skill through positional advantage. Static defense negated every technical superiority the machines possessed. The artillery preparation exemplified the doctrinal mismatch. German defensive positions absorbed over 1 million shells in the opening barrages. Katyusha rocket batteries delivered concentrated fire that severed communication lines between forward positions and reserve formations. Without functioning communications, elastic defense became impossible. Individual strongpoints fought isolated battles, unable to coordinate the mobile responses their doctrine required. The tactical manual of the 93rd Separate Tank Brigade codified Soviet operational learning. If the enemy has occupied the defense, do not assault it. It is better to bypass. This principle, operational maneuver rather than frontal reduction, exploited the fundamental weakness of undermanned elastic defense. German armor, technically superior in direct engagement, could not simultaneously defend everywhere. Soviet mass could afford to bypass strongpoints, leaving them irrelevant. The Panther's 140mm penetration became meaningless when T-34/85s simply avoided engagement, driving past isolated defenders toward operational objectives in the rear. On February 2, 1945, the Stavka in Moscow faced a map that revealed both triumph and constraint. Soviet forces had advanced 480 kilometers in 3 weeks, but the Oder crossings lay just 60 kilometers from Berlin, tantalizingly close, operationally premature. The 60-day halt was not hesitation but necessity. The Soviet operational method, this doctrine of cascading penetration through sequential echelons, demanded functional logistics. By mid-April, 1st Belarusian Front had accumulated 7,147 railcars of ammunition at forward depots. The Katyusha brigades now possessed sufficient ordnance for sustained urban bombardment. At 3 a.m. on April 16th, 20,000 guns opened fire on the Silo Heights. The barrage announced the Berlin operation, not a new campaign, but the terminal phase of the offensive begun in January. The geographic corridor carved by the winter advance now funneled 3 Soviet fronts toward a single objective. By April 21st, the 136th Army Gun Brigade placed shells in central Berlin. By April 25th, encirclement closed at Kutrin as the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts linked. On April 30th, the victory banner rose over the Reichstag, hoisted by the 756th and 674th Rifle Regiments. On May 2nd, General Weidling signed surrender documents. 134,000 prisoners laid down arms. On May 8th, at Karlshorst, Field Marshal Keitel affixed his signature to unconditional surrender. The line of causation ran directly from the Vistula River crossings in January to that Berlin suburb in May. A single operational continuum spanning 4 months, 600 kilometers, and the destruction of German military capacity east of the Elbe. The Wehrmacht, stretched to breaking across that 500-kilometer front in early January, had finally collapsed. Not from a single blow, but from the relentless arithmetic of forces they could never sustain. The Vistula-Oder offensive represents the ultimate realization of Soviet deep battle doctrine. Not merely attacking, but sustaining forward movement across distances that strain logistics, command, and unit cohesion. Not merely breaking through, but transforming tactical penetration into operational catastrophe before defenders can react. The transformation occurred not in individual combat actions, but in the coordination centers of the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts. 1st Echelon Rifle armies fixed defenders in place. Artillery pulverized command infrastructure. Tank armies held in reserve exploited ruptures before defensive coherence could reconstitute. The mechanics unfolded with industrial precision. General Weidling understood what had happened. The Eastern Front is like a house of cards. If there is a breakthrough at one single place, the whole thing will collapse. Between January 12th and February 2nd, 1945, the Red Army proved him right. The house of cards fell, and nothing could rebuild it. If this breakdown of one of history's most devastating military operations gave you a new perspective on the Eastern Front, subscribe to the channel. We cover the battles, the decisions, and the operational realities that determined the outcome of the Second World War, with the technical depth these stories deserve. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one.